I'm Emily Grant. I'm a senior double major in biology and health communication, and I'm from Columbus, Nebraska. Today, I will be sharing with you my communication capstone research, and this research looks at the mentoring relationships that were present in a life science research experience program for undergraduate students. Throughout this presentation, that will be referred to as REU. I chose to do this research after I was invited to participate in an REU program at a large southern university. So as part of this experience, I decided to do my communication internship that was required as part of my communication studies major. So I ended up doing that with Dr. Katie Grace, and that experience is what laid the groundwork for the research that I ended up conducting in communication theory. And I ended up taking communication theory as a junior. So I would like to thank Dr. Katie Grace and also Dr. Austin McDonald for helping me with conducting this research. This is a picture of the cohort of undergraduate students that I spent time with during my REU experience. I will start off today by explaining the significance and rationale for why I did this research. Then I will briefly explain relevant literature, my theoretical framework, and the method of how I did this research, before finally talking about the results and discussion. There are many significant outcomes that come from an undergraduate participating in research. This includes things such as an undergraduate being more likely to pursue graduate study in the biological sciences. The mentoring relationship that an undergraduate has with their research mentor may influence the quality of these outcomes. Most literature focuses on diverse REU experiences within single studies, rather than focusing on a single REU program in a single study. Now I'll talk about my research questions. My first research question is, how does communication between undergraduate and their research mentor help to establish the mentoring relationship? My second research question is, how useful is the mentoring relationship established between an undergraduate and their mentor in the REU experience? And my last research question is, to what extent does the mentoring received in the REU program influence undergraduates' career intentions? In the interest of time, I want to share a very brief review of relevant literature rather than diving into my entire literature review for this project. So, Crisp et al. In 2017 found that there is no single definition of mentoring present in the literature. So for this reason, I defined mentoring in my study as the individuals responsible for overseeing the work of the undergraduate researcher. Ebby et al. In 2000 found that mentoring relationships cannot simply be classified as either being positive or negative. The REU experience itself provides undergraduates the ability to work in a lab with a faculty mentor for 9 to 10 weeks. And previous work, also by Hauser, Lemons, and Cahill in 2013, found that the decision to pursue a graduate degree was unaffected by the relationship a student had with their faculty mentor. Social penetration theory was developed by Altman and Taylor in 1973 to explain how self-disclosure influences relational intimacy. Social penetration theory is concerned with breadth and depth of self-disclosure. There are 4 different layers of depth of self-disclosure. The first is the surface layer, and this involves disclosing very superficial facts, which can be learned by looking at a person or through small talk. The peripheral disclosures involve sharing information that would be shared in most social settings but do not require any intimacy. Intermediate disclosures become limited to information that most people are more selective about disclosing. And the central layer of self-disclosure involves information that is shared being very private and personal, so it's shared only between extremely close relational partners. The breadth of self-disclosure refers to the general topics that are discussed in conversations. Again, there are 4 stages of breadth. The first is the orientation stage, and this is where people share only superficial information about themselves. So caution is exercised when deciding to disclose information. In the exploratory affective stage, discussion between relational partners begins to enter the periphery and intermediate layers as a wider range of topics are being discussed. And in the affective exchange stage, depth reaches the central disclosure layer. However, there's a sense of caution between 2 relational partners at this stage, and central disclosure is only reached in some topic areas. In the stable exchange stage, both breadth and depth occur at all levels of self-disclosure and across all possible topics. In this stage, the cost of self-disclosure is low since each person in the relationship is deeply invested in it. And deep penetration is the process that occurs when the relationship begins to dissolve. As intimacy decreases, the breadth and depth of topics that relational partners discuss will also decrease. So I use social penetration theory for my theoretical framework for this study because the theory itself was developed to understand interpersonal relationships, which is what the mentoring relationship also is. The specific method that I used for my study was called a case study, and this is an exploration of a bounded system or case or multiple cases over time through detailed, in-depth data collection involving multiple sources of information rich in context. And this definition comes from Creswell in 1998. So for my study, I specifically used ethnographic participant observations and semi-structured interviews. Ethnographic participant observations involve studying people as they go about their daily lives, and often involves collecting data in the form of field notes that detail a researcher's account of a cultural group. Fieldwork was conducted when I was an undergraduate researcher in the summer of 2018 in an REU program, and that's what provided the basis for the current study. Each evening, I wrote field notes that detailed the interactions that took place in the specific lab that I worked in. These field notes ended up totaling 157 pages of observations. As you can tell, I wrote a lot. While the ethnographic participant observations are not a major contributing source of data to the current study, they help to shape my relationships with study participants, as I was actively reflecting on the communication practices that were present during my time as an undergraduate in this REU program. Additionally, some of the interview questions that provide the main source of data for the current study were developed based on questions I became curious about during the summer ethnographic fieldwork. Semi-structured interviews have predetermined general questions, but allow the researcher to ask follow-up questions to clarify participant answers. I interviewed 5 of the undergraduates and mentors that I interacted with during the summer. Specifically, I interviewed 4 people that were categorized as mentors and 1 undergraduate. These interviews took place in the spring of 2019. The interviews allowed me to gain their perspectives on the mentoring that took place in the specific REU experience, as well as to confirm or dispute the findings from my ethnographic participant observations. Each interview consisted of 12 or 13 predetermined questions and lasted approximately 30 minutes. The general format of each interview differed depending on whether the participant was a mentor or an undergraduate. For the purpose of this study, the postdoctoral researcher that participated was classified as a mentor, and therefore was asked the same general interview questions as the other mentors in the study. The data from these interviews was analyzed using qualitative content analysis, which involves the process of open coding, creating categories, and abstraction. So now to talk about my results. So my first research question, again, was how does communication between undergraduate and the research mentor help to establish the mentoring relationship? So for this research question, I broke it down into a few different themes. The first was that mentors initially communicate expectations and clarify goals. So one mentor said, I try to reiterate my expectations for the kind of time that they put in and how that will look. And sometimes I lay out a little bit of a timeline for them. The next theme I found was that mentors varied in their willingness to form personal relationships with mentees. That variance is kind of illustrated by these three quotes. So I don't want them to feel like they have to disclose personal information to me if they don't feel comfortable. So some people are big sharers and some people are not. And so I kind of just follow their lead on that. And these two mentors illustrate mentors that are less willing to form personal relationships, depending on what the undergraduate wants to do with that. And then lastly, the third mentor says, I just want to get to know my students outside of the research we do. Oh, because it makes it more meaningful to me. So this mentor is she described herself as being a very relational person. So for her, forming a relationship with the student that she's mentoring is very important in how the mentoring relationship ends up. The last theme I found with this research question was that independence depends on mentee capability and comfort. So this longer quote is from one of the mentors describing how she has her undergraduates face challenges. She says, so if it's a challenge that is surmountable by themselves, I might ask for their thoughts on what they want to do. I might bat around ideas with them. I might ask them what they need to be able to overcome the challenge. And then, fly little bird fly. If it's a challenge that they are really not capable of overcoming by themselves, then we sit down and work on it together. For example, if it's a new type of analysis and they simply need to work alongside with someone, we'll sit down and work on it together. And I thought this quote really illustrates this theme very well. Also in my data, one of the mentors explained how she has students who don't necessarily feel terribly comfortable working at first, but independence is a huge part of one of the main goals of the REU program. So she kind of eases students into working independently, and by the end, they're often more comfortable working independently for longer periods of time. And then another of the mentors said that sometimes students can work alone more quickly. And the mentors kind of just have to judge this based on how well the student is working and whether or not they are able of doing a lot of problem solving on their own. And that's just observed by watching the student work. So my second research question was, how useful is the mentoring relationship established between an undergraduate and their mentor in the REU experience? So here I found two different themes in my data. The first is that mentors help students gain clarification in career goals and confidence. One mentor says, so I like them to have that sense of confidence or self-efficacy, but anytime I work with a student, I really just hope that the work we do serves them in the future going forward. And another mentor says, I think the thing is that they gain some clarification about what they want to do next. So whether that's going on to grad school with us in biology, or whether it's going on to grad school at the institution that I was at, or even potentially working with me, hopefully they come out of it with some increased clarity. The second theme that I found from this research question was that mentors gain enjoyment and help with their research. One mentor says, well, a lot of help with research, which is so valuable, when I asked her what she gains from the experience. Another mentor says, it just makes the work more enjoyable. If I was doing it by myself, I could sure get it done, but it would also not be as interesting and fun. So basically this illustrates that not only do the undergraduate students get something out of the experience, the mentors are also well served by these relationships. The last research question was, to what extent does the mentoring received in the REU program influence the undergraduate's career intentions? Here I also found two different themes. The first was that students have gone on two diverse career paths. So one of them, for example, right now is a high school teacher, and then another REU student I worked with is actually a data analyst for a company in Texas. One of them is working somewhere where she's a tutor, but she's applying to veterinary school. And then another mentor explained that she's noticed more students entering biology education. She says, but what I've noticed is as we've gone through the years, a higher percentage of the students we're bringing into as fellows have already a pretty real interest in biology education research. But I would say early on, it was only, I would have to guess 20% or less. And now maybe it might be as high as 40 or 50%, depending on the cohort. So I thought it was interesting to see that early on, as this program was newer, biology education is also very much an emerging field. So it kind of makes sense that less students ended up going on to do things in biology education than, say, the later cohorts. The second theme I found for my third research question was that the REU serves as a turning point for undergraduates' career goals. The undergraduate I interviewed says, so the REU basically changed my whole career path. After participating in the REU program, I decided to pursue graduate school because I love the research. The results of this study suggest that the development of mentoring relationships in the REU setting depends on the communication goals held by the individuals that participate in the relationship. In the context of social penetration theory, the mentoring relationships that are held by the mentors and mentees in this particular REU setting remain mostly in the surface or periphery layers. There are several factors that could account for this finding, but the length of time that the REU mentoring relationships span before depenetration occurs is likely why this happens. In an environment that is highly task-oriented, like the REU setting, this means that it is likely that most conversations that are happening between an undergraduate and their mentor are related to the specific research they're working on. In the context of previous literature suggests that receiving advice about future goals can have long-lasting impacts on undergraduate students, according to a study done by Pita et al. In 2013. And this study also supports this result, as the mentoring received by the undergraduate participants in this study was found to have long-lasting impacts, as indicated by the third research question. Previous literature has also found that the undergraduate's decision to pursue a graduate degree was unaffected by their relationship with their REU mentor. This was found by Hauser, Lemons, and Cahill in 2013. The current study found that the REU experience was a turning point for the undergraduates that had recently completed the program, which contradicts these results. This contradicting result suggests that further exploration of this specific research question is warranted. There are also several limitations to my research. First is the small sample size. Second, I had prior relationships with all participants. This allowed all of my participants to be comfortable in disclosing information to me. However, it also created a situation where all of the mentors who had participated in this research took the time to serve as a mentor to me, even as I was interviewing them, and not just when I participated in the REU program. Instances of this continued mentorship really occurred throughout this project. When I contacted one of the mentors specifically, she very readily agreed to participate in the research, but she also sent me two of her lab's papers related to the mentoring of undergraduates in the life sciences, and I included both of these studies in my original literature review. Additionally, two of the mentors suggested revising some of the interview questions that I asked. I did not end up revising either of these questions, and responses to one of them was not included in my results section. However, one of these questions was included in my results section. So it's possible that revising this question at that mentor's suggestion would have resulted in answers that were slightly different from the participants that I interviewed after the mentor had suggested that revision. And lastly, this research focused on a biology education program, which means that the mentors that I interviewed were all experienced and knowledgeable about social science research and interview techniques. So this means that they sometimes shared insights related to how their answers would come across when I was analyzing the interview transcripts. So basically, there was a lot of metacognitive thinking occurring with all of my participants. And it means that my participants may have taken more care to present answers that they thought would provide useful data. Secondly, some of the mentors engaged in metacognitive thinking as a way to reflect on their current mentoring practices and to realize the areas that they think they currently fall short of how they ideally would like to provide mentorship to RU students. So the element of this reflection in how they're thinking about their thought process behind mentoring students is certainly a highly unique aspect of this study, and it may mean that I ended up gathering data that presents elements that describe how my participants think they should mentor instead of providing thoughts about how they should actually mentor students. And this presence of this metacognitive thinking in my data initially made it very, very difficult to analyze once I realized that this was happening. So I had to step back and kind of figure out how I was going to complete this analysis, even though there were several instances of this across all transcripts. So future research should look at multiple undergraduate cohorts, which would hopefully increase the sample size of undergraduate students in this research. And future research should also look at further exploration of undergraduate outcomes, as I mentioned previously. Thank you very much for watching my presentation over my capstone communication research. It was a very valuable experience being able to do this research. I definitely grew a lot as a researcher throughout this process. It was a very long process because from the time I started my field work to the time I completed my interviews and analyzing them, it took over a year. So I definitely found a lot of value in completing a very long research project. So thank you very much for watching, and if you have questions, feel free to email me.